one of the most destructive forces in nature. Fire.
This incredibly charged moorland is as close as we can get to what is a major incident here in the Scottish Highlands.
Fort William last night, a town framed by fire.
This is the extent of what nearly became the UK's largest ever wildfire. This is the Scottish Highlands near Canich.
But when used correctly, an essential tool. Out-of-control wildfires have caused untold damage across the world and at home here in the UK. Are we doing enough to protect our uplands from the risk of fire? And in the process, are we damaging the climate with how we manage the land?
This is the British Uplands Podcast with Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts. An exploration of change in one of the UK's most important landscapes.
Grant to take down trees, plant to put hedges, grant to dig ditches, plants put on sheep, no grants for sheep come off.
Oh, the uplands, they're burning the peat.
If you hear a simple argument put forward about how the uplands need to be managed, then that simple argument has to be wrong.
Definitely going to cut that out of the podcast. Earlier in the year, I travelled into the hills, following lines of smoke drifting down the glens. It's muirburn season, where gamekeepers like Will Curr are burning old heather to encourage new growth. But this practice is controversial, and to try and get to the bottom of why, I wanted to see it for myself.
So, Will, I just walked up the hill from the bottom here. Thanks for making me walk all the way to the top. Lots of the hill is on fire today, and I've been hearing from various people as to why this goes on. But just explain to me what kind of conditions you need to do this this rotational burning or muirburn.
So ideally we need dry weather, quite a light wind, in order to light a line of fire and let the wind carry it across the hill. Yep. So it needs to be dry, but we also need a little bit of moisture in the ground so that it's not too dry going into the moss.
Okay. Is that just so you burn the surface?
Yep, so we just burn the vegetation on the top, and as you can see from these fires, if you move the ash, the green moss is still there and unharmed.
And you've been driving a tractor around the hill. Obviously I've been watching, taking some photos and stuff. You've had a young guy running up and down the hill lighting fires with like a gas canister, and you've been driving around in the tractor. How do they work together?
So ideally, if it's quite fit, we would cut round.
What do you mean by fit?
So fit is dry and quite a good wind. Yep.
Okay.
The right conditions. We would cut round the designated area that we want to burn, and then Andrew would then light it, and the theory is that it goes out at the swipes, at the cut, where we've cut it.
Oh, so it's so you're using the tractor to cut a fire break around the area?
Yep, so okay. Exactly, using the tractor to cut a fire break, and then when it reaches there, because of the fuel loads being cut and thrown out to the side, it then goes out normally. But if it's quite dry, it can sometimes burn across the cut, so you need to put 2 cuts around each fire. Okay. And if it's not quite as fit or the conditions aren't quite as good, we would light a fire and then use the tractor to put out the edges once it's burned.
Okay, so I saw you doing that a little bit, yep. Just to put the fire out. And yep. How do you work it? Because I'm driving around looking at, and I can see that there's a plan, but how do you work out where you're burning, or how much space is between them, or how many fires?
So ideally we want 20 yards wide, and as long as we can get them to go 100 yards, but we want to leave, within 100 yards we want to leave long heather for nesting for the grouse, and then we also want some quite medium, sort of up to 5-10 centimetres for good feeding, and then short heather, which will then become the feeding for the years to come.
Have you managed to have many days this burning season that have been the right conditions?
I think we're on about day 6 now. So
when does the season start?
starts on the 1st of October.
Okay.
Finishes the 15th of April.
So day 6 this year?
Yep, day 6 this year.
Okay.
We didn't get any days in back end in October this year because it was the conditions weren't right. But this year it seems to be going well now. We've got all of March ahead of us, so hopefully we'll be able to get.
Saying that, there was some rain on my face as I was walking up.
Yeah,
here.
and I think there's snow due next week as well, so that's probably not going to help the situation.
Brilliant. Well, it's amazing to see, and fire's kind of beautiful.
No, it's nice, very nice, isn't it? As long as they don't get too big.
Yeah. How? I mean, I guess. You're watching that the whole time,
yeah,
right?
so watching it the whole time, but then because we're quite a well-managed moor, it's generally not going to go that far until it bumps into an old fire or real short heather. Then it's quite easy to catch up with. But if it was left unburned and a fire was to get away, it's so hard to put it out because you can't get near to the fire because it's so hot, because the fuel load's that big, it gives off so much heat. And that's when you get sort of wildfires. So
you're saying that even if you didn't go and cut it, eventually, cut round it like you're doing now, eventually there would be, because of the way you've been doing this for years and years, and I can see all the patterns on the hill, eventually it would probably hit something that would put itself out?
Maybe not put itself out, but slow it down so that in order us to get to it with either the tractor or a leaf blower,
okay.
And then put it out. But if we go into an area where there's quite a big bed of heather, quite a big fuel load, it can be quite tricky if the fire gets too big to put it out.
But these practices are coming under pressure. The Scottish Government is working to introduce stricter regulation, which would see muirburn licensed to ensure people are following the rules. In the Scottish Parliament, MSPs heard evidence from a range of interest groups as they work towards a decision on future legislation. Here is Robbie Kernaghan from Nature Scot, the government's key advisor on the natural environment.
The evidence base for the benefits or disbenefits of burning on peatlands, both from a carbon lens and a nature lens, is complicated. But I'm going to take a step back and just remind ourselves, in a nature and climate crisis, where 50% of our emissions are coming from land use, and between 15 and 20% of those are coming from peatlands, the existing position that Nature Scot take is that burning on peatlands is not a good idea. It is already not recommended through the Peatland Code, and this bill is providing, I think, additional safeguard to ensure that if we are going to burn on the peatland, which has to remain a tool in the toolbox, it's for very specific purposes in very specific places, and that is primarily to address the issue of wildfires getting out of hand and to protect some of our important carbon and biodiversity assets.
The Muirburn Code does recommend against burning on peat, but by the definition of the code, it is only regarded as peat if it is more than 50 centimetres deep. We have already heard in a previous episode that regulation using peat depth has its own problems, a view shared by Bruce Farquharson from the Scottish Fire Service.
The differentiation in peat depth is, from my perspective, irrelevant. There is evidence, perhaps not entirely empirical, but very practical, that managed cool burn, as the phrase that was used, muir burn across the surface does not penetrate any more than a centimetre below the surface of peatland. But my concern is that if we restrict where muir burn can be carried out by bringing in a specified depth, and what we're doing is allowing a larger proportion of the fuel loading to be unmanaged. And the very thing we're trying to prevent, which is damage to the peatlands, will in fact be at higher risk, because a wildfire absolutely will damage the peatland, whereas a muir burn, whilst I acknowledge does carry some risk, there is never a zero risk application of fire to vegetation. So it's a smaller risk, however, because it's managed, controlled, and the phrase that's current is cool, as opposed to a very, very hot and uncontrolled wildfire. The practice of muir burn, however, is instrumental in reducing the risk of wildfire because it manages the fuel load, and it's the fuel load that's the real problem when it comes to the intensity of fire that we're seeing. So climate change isn't having an impact on the number of fires we're having, but it is having an impact on the fire behaviour we're seeing and the intensity of fires. That, combined with an increased fuel load or an unmanaged fuel load, will result in a perfect storm for wildfires.
As is often the case, not everyone agrees. This was the response from Duncan Orr-Ewing from the RSPB.
The Nature Scott report that was published recently looking at muirburn and peatland said there was a lack of evidence from Scottish or UK studies that a reduction in fuel loads arising from muirburn influences the occurrence of wildfire on moorland, and that's a direct quote from that report. I mean, I think, we're talking about a climate crisis here. 80% of our peatland resource in Scotland is damaged, and in 2019 it emitted 6.3 million tonnes of CO2, which is more than the energy supply and residential sectors. The Scottish Government is investing £250 million in restoring peatlands, and there is evidence now, growing evidence, including from Saddleworth Moor actually in England, and our neighbouring reserve there at Dovestone, that actually restored habitats are more resilient to wildfire than non-restored habitats.
We started this episode by visiting the site of an active muirburn, but I wanted to head away from the corridors of Holyrood and back to the hills and see what it looks like a few months after. Gamekeeper Alex Jenkins, who we heard from on the last show, explained to me what I was looking at.
So now we're walking on some burn from this year.
Yep.
It's all charred and black.
Yep.
Still smells a little bit.
Again, not too hot a fire. You can see it's not taken down any of the moss.
No.
Or anything like that. It's just whipped off the surface vegetation, which is quite an important consideration. A lot of bad press about folks saying we're burning peat and that sort of thing these days.
Yeah.
We're nowhere near the peat. I mean, you dig down through that.
So we're just digging down through a bit of the sphagnum. It goes a long way down and it's so wet.
And it goes.
Oh, it smells earthy.
Yeah. You'll have to go a long way.
We are probably 12 inches down. Oh, there you go. Just
not quite.
Not quite.
I wouldn't.
Barely. But that's amazing, though. That just shows you.
That's still a long way off turning to peat.
But this is.
There you go.
Oh, there you go. Got just the start of the peat, so maybe a foot and a half down.
Yeah.
But what I'm got out in my hand here, which was 2 handfuls before you got to the peat, is I can see that this is the sphagnum breaking down. Oh yeah, you're wringing water out of that.
You use fire in the landscape as a management tool, but there are a lot of reasons for that, and there's equally a lot of implications if that wasn't used. And I know that I think you've got new rules and regulations coming in this year, or
yes, in terms of training.
In terms of training,
anybody that conducts muirburn going forward is going to have to be sort of accredited with the government, which I think is probably fairly sensible.
Yeah. Okay.
To be fair,
but there are some people who would like to see no fire management in the landscape.
Yeah.
So why do you do it? How does it fit into the landscape?
So the main reason that we burn the hills is for regeneration, to regenerate the heather. The heather's it's the lifeblood of the hill. It's what the grouse feed off. It's what the sheep feed off. The mountain hares feed off. The deer eat. It's what sustains everything up there. It's our grass crop, for want of a better word.
Okay,
if you were feeding livestock, it's the same sort of thing. So in order to regenerate the heather, because as heather grows, the plant gets older. Degenerate heather, we call it. It gets rank, straggly. There's not so much nutritional.
It's like very
goodness.
Woody and thick.
Yeah, very woody, sort of thick. There's not so much nutritional goodness in the tips. Whereas when it's quite young, it grows rapidly, readily. The young growth on the tips is the highly nutritious bit of the plant. That's what gives the benefit to the deer and the grouse and the sheep and whatnot. So once it gets to that sort of woody degenerate stage, we burn it off. We're a controlled fire. The fire just burns it down to the stalks, and then the seed bed that's lying in the ground kicks off partly through the fire in a lot of the cases, if the fire's of a certain temperature, regenerates the seed and just resets. But we don't just want to burn the whole hill. You know, particularly for the ground nesting birds, they need a mosaic of habitats. So when we do burn, we tend to burn in ideally 60-yard wide sort of strips. A key point of the burning we do is it reduces the fuel load. This is something we see in Spain and Australia and California and stuff, big style now. It's not dissimilar in Scotland. It's obviously just on a slightly smaller scale. That being said, there was a fire in the Flow Countries a few years ago, which can be seen from satellites in space. It was that big.
Wow.
Yeah. And the Flow Country is wringing wet. Still burns. When conditions are right, it'll still burn. So because we're doing this muirburn every year, and in a good year on this estate, for example, we could have 450 fires in a year. That's obviously a bit weather dependent, but it fluctuates about that number. We're reducing the fuel load all the time. If it wasn't burnt, you would see a stage where the heather would all grow at a uniformed rate on the hill to the point where you have just degenerate heather everywhere. The fuel load's massive, and that's when you get the wildfire that takes the entire hill.
There are, however, voices calling for muirburn to be stopped. Dr. Helen Armstrong was commissioned by Revive, a coalition for grouse moor reform, to address the question of whether muirburn on grouse moors increases or decreases carbon emissions.
You don't need to burn them. There is no reason to burn them. The only reason I think that you would burn them for grouse would be if they had been drained and there'd been an increase in the heather cover. So then the heather will grow tall and leggy unless you burn it. But if it hasn't been drained, then it's functioning as a blanket bog. There's a high cover of sphagnum bog mosses. So the water table is high. There is no reason to burn it. But we have no monitoring currently of where burning actually takes place. So currently in Scotland, there is no monitoring of burning.
But there is a best practice guidance, though.
But we don't know who is following best practice and who isn't, because no monitoring takes place. We do know that under best practice, you're not supposed to burn on blanket bogs, but we know on peatlands. But we know that the best information we have is that about 40% of burning for grouse takes place on peatlands. So we know that 40% of it isn't being burnt according to best practice. And because no monitoring actually takes place, there's no assessment from satellite images, for example, of where the burning is happening, whether it's on steep slopes at high altitude, next to rivers, what frequency the burning is taking place. Because we don't have that regular monitoring, we don't know how much burning is taking place that is following best practice and how much isn't. Anecdotally, people say there's a lot that isn't, but that's anecdotal. Oh, and the other thing I suppose to say is that, of course, a lot of our dry heathland and bog SSSIs have been assessed as being in unfavourable condition. That's sites of special scientific interest. They've been assessed as being in unfavourable condition because of burning. So there is evidence out there that burning is not always taking place according to best practice.
And this desire for more oversight is one of the reasons the Scottish Government say they want to licence muirburn. Helen also argues that muirburn is holding the uplands in an unnatural state.
What we have now with heather moorland, with vast areas, large areas of burnt heather moorland that's kept in this state of heather moorland because of the burning and in some cases the grazing as well. It's not the climax vegetation community, and it's not what would be there if you didn't burn. You'd have woodland, you'd have scrub, you'd have a mosaic of different types of habitats of all different ages, of all different types, some open, some scrubby, some woody. And with all those different habitats, you'd have very high biodiversity.
Where do we draw the line between being concerned about global biodiversity and localized biodiversity? If we are often focused on making sure that certain species exist in a global context.
Well, there aren't any species that I think would be that threatened, to be honest, if we
or ecosystems, I should say.
Moorland. Well, dry heather moorland, we can protect some areas of dry heather moorland, but we don't need to have it all, because we get so much more if we stop burning it and let it do what it wants to do, which is to turn into scrub, woodland, tall shrub communities, a whole range of different habitats. As I said, many of them that almost disappeared long ago from Scotland. We get so much more biodiversity back that we have to balance whether, because we have large areas of a degraded ecosystem that is quite rare globally, whether we want to protect that. It seems a little perverse in a way to have to protect something because nobody else has degraded their land quite as much as we have.
Clearly, science and opinion is divided on this topic, but one of the most recent and longest-running studies on muirburn was carried out by Dr. Andreas Heinemeier, where he looked at the impact of 3 upland management methods. Sarah travelled to York University to meet him.
There is a huge mountain pressure now on carbon and the carbon cycle, carbon storage, carbon credits with the carbon rush. Everything is all coming back down to carbon. But you actually looked a little bit about how the muirburn and how the cutting and how leaving it, how all of those 3 things affected carbon storage in this area, didn't you?
Yeah.
Do we have some results you can show me?
When I started off with a project, being a German, coming to the UK, I mean, I've never shot a grouse in my life. I did not know that you would actually shoot grouse. So I applied for this grant from DEFRA, maybe a bit naively, but I think also it's somehow actually a blessing for me, because I went in without any prejudice.
You sound like me coming into this study now.
So I was just
an
ecologist, and I just thought, oh, that's a really good question. And I loved the long-term aspect, so I went for that. But then soon I realised, whoa, what did I let myself in for? Because when I started off, I thought, surely burning, well, you just lose the carbon. It must be an easy one to monitor and capture. And then I opened my eyes and realised, whoa, it's actually not that simple, because when you do burn, yes, of course you have big emissions initially, but not everything burns. I didn't really realise.
I didn't have a clue either.
Particularly when you burn quite old heather, so maybe 65–70% of the biomass is combusted.
Yes.
That's what other studies have sort of seen, and we observed that in our study as well. Lots is left standing as either sticks, which are quite charred, so they're very black, and they seem to stand there. So that carbon isn't lost.
It's like charcoal.
Not entirely, but quite a lot of it's charcoal, but also lots of the leaves and twigs, they are really turned into proper charcoal. And that can be 5 to 10%, so it's not minute. When you add those sticks and the charcoal together, it's a lot left over. Maybe sort of 20% is not combusted. So it does sound like, oh well, lots is gone up in the first year, but actually quite a lot is left over. And when you think about, and that's what sort of made me realise, oh yes, the long term is key, because when you do the alternative, the cutting, yes, you don't have the initial combustion, the big loss, but I mentioned the compost heap, so you have, when you cut and leave brush, it's all there. But 1 year after, it's maybe 10% less, because it's decomposed, it's rotted away. 2 years after,
releases it
20%
anyway.
maybe, and then 30%. And if you add that up over 10 or 20 years in our case, where will the balance be? Will actually the 20% saved from the burning, or 10 to 20%, be better than letting it rot away, and you might only end up with 5 to 10%, because long-term rotting away, decomposition of brush, you only get a few percent forming peat. The rest decomposes. So, and that is
so what you're saying is,
found.
When you've burnt it, the leftover, the charcoaly bits and the sort of broken bits, they'll go into the peat.
It's pretty
and
stable.
They get stored there.
Absolutely, and we find that, and that's it. Literally, it was an eye-opening moment when we took the peat core. So you go in with a big corer, take out the peat, and you see, like in our textbook, you can turn the pages just from the top down, because each year a new layer of peat is formed.
Through the burning process.
It's not rotated, or just natural vegetation dying back, the leaf litter, like here the leaves fall down each year. So you build up peat, and every 20 or so years you do a burn. That's what's been done over the past few hundred years. And you see the burn layers coming, and we measure that absolutely nearly every 20 years. And in between, it's just carbon accumulation because the plants grow, the roots put litter in, the leaves put litter in.
What differences did you see in the regrowth between cut or burnt?
Yeah, so I come back to that in a minute. I think it might be good to look at this first, and then we pick up on comparing the treatments. So we started off here with the uncut old heather, about 25-year-old heather. It's taking up carbon. It's a carbon gain year after year. But then we do a management, burning the red line here. And you have that big carbon loss combustion. So it releases in the first year. But then the plants regrow. And they regrow quite rapidly. And you will see when you compare to the cut one, the mown one here, the green line, there is much less carbon loss because, we've just mown it, the brush is there.
Yeah.
So you don't have that combustion loss, but you still have losses because decomposition is going on. And this is what I meant. It just year after year, it adds up. It decomposes for much longer. So you actually end up with a higher loss or a lower gain over 15 years. That's what our prediction shows, and 20 years.
Yes.
So that's the scenario we only measured up to here, but this is what our measurement data show. Whereas the burnt one, it just recovered so quickly. Now, this relates to your last question. So if we compare the plants, what we saw is that the uncut ones are getting older and older, the heather, and it becomes less and less efficient overall. And that's, human beings, we get older, we become less efficient. When you look at these trees, they are in their prime, they take up a lot of carbon, come in 50 years, they are much less efficient. So although you have a huge biomass, it's actually very less efficient because you have a lot of
stopped growing, really.
Respiration, maintaining your body. You use a lot of sugars just for that. And that's what we see. So the heather becomes nutrient limited because it just doesn't get rejuvenated, and less efficient. So it declines the carbon uptake. It's still a carbon gain, but it becomes less and less each year. Whereas the burned ones, when you do burn, charcoal, but you also add ash, and ash is full of
carbon.
Nutrients. Carbon, there is some carbon, but the nutrients, exactly. So you have the charcoal, really the carbon, and then the ash, which people love to put down because everybody knows it's nutrient rich.
So the charcoal is what's helping the plant.
Charcoal
so
and
actually, oh gosh, that's so the opposite.
Exactly. So the nutrient fertilization really stimulated the regrowth and the uptake capacity of the plants. And that's what we actually measured. So when we noticed this difference, we thought, we better take some heather shoot samples and analyze them for the nutrient content and for all the key elements which are needed for green leaves to take up carbon via photosynthesis, the process which fixes carbon. We noticed a massively increased nutrient content in the burned treatment.
One of the few things there seems to be a consensus on in the scientific community is the importance of keeping our moorlands wet and restoring damage from the historic draining of the moors for agriculture. But Andreas doesn't believe that a hands-off approach is the right decision.
So ideally, re-wet, where you can re-wet. But loads of sites, they will be outside the really wet, high rainfall area. So they will be inherently drier, even without drainage. They will be just drier. So those sites, to just walk away and say, it will look after itself, it will re-wet itself, there is no proof for that will really protect those peatlands, because even an intact peatland can get very dry during a summer drought. I mean, think about last year, 35 degrees we measured at all our peatland sites, and for weeks it was very dry. So even in intact areas, the water table depth will go down to 30, 40, 50 centimeters. The peat surface will be dry enough to burn when the fire comes along. So it might be barbecue, it might be lightning, God knows what. But then even a wet peatland could easily catch fire and burn.
So we've got a bit of a problem on our hands right now, haven't we?
But I think just saying all will be well by re-wetting and walking away and looking the other way will most likely be the worst decision in history for peatlands. We need to really consider the options, and all tools and options should be in the bag. So there might be areas where walking away will be absolutely fine, but loads of areas I don't think it will be fine.
From what you have heard, opinions differ greatly as to whether muirburn is beneficial or harmful to our uplands. As with many of the issues we have discussed, the answer depends on what you want out of the landscape and whether you measure success on a short or long-term timescale. One thing is certain: as the climate warms, the risk of wildfire will likely increase, and our ability to protect our landscape, especially our peatlands, will continue to be challenged. The choices that we make now will have lasting consequences. We are taking a 2-week break before coming back with the last 3 episodes of this series, so join us again on September the 12th as we look at how wildlife shapes the management of our uplands.
The British Uplands series is presented by Byron Pace and Sarah Roberts, co-produced and edited by David Shanks as part of the Into the Wilderness podcast, an MH Studios production.